this whole frame just comes right off, and I'm going to be gluing another board right to the face of this.
To make that frame, I started off with a large piece of black walnut and cut it into smaller strips, and then took that over to the jointer, and then of course the planer, until finally I had all the necessary parts to make up the end blocks. Here I cut one of the larger boards in half, and these will eventually become the two boards that get attached to that frame. Now, while I was using the jointer, I was very careful to make sure that I was avoiding the bug holes. So sometimes I had to go down farther than I wanted until the front looked nice and smooth. And here it is, no bug holes in sight. With the larger board that goes on the end cap complete, I can now start on the rails of the frame. So I'm going to go ahead and plane down the boards to a uniform thickness. With each pass on the jointer, I'm looking at the edge to get the minimal number of bug holes in the board, because they will show. A pass through the planer is going to make sure that the boards are parallel with the side that I did on the jointer. And now I'm cutting the blocks that go in the center of the frame. Each block is a slightly different size depending on where it is on the bench.
Here are all the pieces that I've been planing down, so they're all the same thickness. And I've made marks on the board to where all these parts go. So I'm going to line them all up here quickly. On top of this, there'll be another piece of walnut which completes the block, which becomes the mortise. Now, there's tenons right here, and right now, the top of the bench is as wide as it's going to be because it's very humid out. So during the winter, I'm expecting that it's going to contract towards the center. So where I have these little cutouts, there's going to be space in between the blocks. So as the bench contracts towards the middle, it won't get pinched in here. It'll be able to move freely. So I'm going to try to pick this up. And you can see how this will fit right in there. So there's some play built into this and go up a little bit up and down like that, but that's by design. When I actually install this, I'm going to be putting some shims in there to make it nice and tight and level with the top. And of course there is some side-to-side play in here, and eventually this will be bolted straight into the bench top. So now all I have to do is glue this up and then work on the other piece of walnut to put on top of it. I have one of the frames glued up now. I think this marks the first time that I've actually used my workbench as a workbench. You can see that I was able to use my clamps on the bench itself to use these cauls to hold down the middle sections nice and flush. The frame is dry now, and you can see how it fits in over the tenons. And I did not put it right in the middle of the tenons because this one will contract that direction. So there's really not a whole lot of space here. Same thing with the ends, because that should be going that direction when it contracts. And of course it's the opposite on the other side. Before I glue the other board to this frame, I want to make the shims, because it'll be really hard to make them otherwise to fit exactly. So these will go underneath the tenon. Of course, that's just the one shim. I need to make one for this side and for that side. Now, I could have made a perfect mortise with a router or something like that, but that would have wasted a lot of the black walnut. And quite frankly, I'm not sure my skills are good enough to make sure that it's as tight as what this shimming method produces. I now have the board that's going to go on the end. It turned out beautifully. Just a nice solid piece of black walnut. This, of course, is the frame, and it's going to just simply butt up like that. And the grains match pretty well. They're all going the same direction. And of course, it was from the same board, so the color is pretty good. So my next task here is I need to make sure that this frame is sitting absolutely flush to this board so that the glue will have the best adhesion. Now, when I glued this up, I did it on the workbench, so this portion of the frame is absolutely flush with each other. But when I turn it around, and of course this is the side that needs to be glued to the board, while it's very, very close, there's still just a little bit of a difference between the boards. So I'm going to run this through my planer and take off the absolute smallest amount of wood possible so that this entire frame will be nice and flush. Now, before I took this frame off the end of the bench, I took the time to take a knife and I scored exactly where this is going to end. So that represents the edge of the bench. So I'm gluing this board so that it's longer than the frame. But once it's all glued together and dried, I'll then be able to use that mark to cut both boards at the same time. So now it's off to the planer. I'm going to clamp this to the table just like I did when I made the frame itself. My other board has some registration markings on it, so I know exactly where I want it. This is not going to take a whole lot of glue. All I have to do is the frame portion. I don't want a whole lot of squeeze out, not that it will really matter. Now this has to be very strong. There's going to be a fair amount of pressure on this to keep the top from warping. So I'm going to put it right on the edge of my bench, which, as we know, is totally flat. The other board is simply going to go right on top of that. So the only thing that I'm really concerned about right here is making sure that this front face lines totally up nice and flush. I don't really care about the bottom too much. I can fix that later. But I don't want to take off any more on the top of this board, or else it's not going to line up with the bench the way I want it to. So I'm just kind of working this in here. I'm going to use two big offcuts to distribute the weight. And here is the other end block. I did not have enough long clamps to clamp it directly to the bench, so instead I just raised it up a little bit with some blocks so I could get clamps underneath it and put some cauls on top. I unclamped the block and I scraped off the glue and I ran it through the planer. So now both boards pretty much feel like it's just one board here. You can see the mortises. I have it clearly labeled so I know exactly where it goes.
And here it is over the tenons. When I ran this through the planer, I made sure I took off the smallest amount of material possible. So I wanted the surface to be about a 1/16 of an inch below the top of the workbench. That way, if I'm sliding a board or something across the top, it's not going to get hung up on the end cap. So at this point, I'm going to use my chop saw to cut this board to length using the markings that I had made with the knife.
I clamped the board to the saw because this cut needs to be really clean and I don't want any chance of it moving around. I'm anticipating the blade to get very hot and I'll probably have a fair amount of smoke, but I'm trying not to burn the side of the board, but it may happen. This is too thick of a board to go through the table saw in one pass, so that's why I'm using the miter saw. Well, there was a fair amount of smoke with that, but by letting the blade spin in between little cuts, it did a very nice job. Just a little bit of burning, but not much. So I think my blade must be getting pretty dull. Off to do the other side.
Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.